good evening, and welcome. If you're here tonight, you're probably looking for something calm, something slow, steady, and quiet enough to help your thoughts settle. So let's take a deep breath together. Imagine the sound of a soft crackling fire nearby, and the cool night air wrapping around you like a blanket. Tonight, we'll drift into a story from history, one filled with quiet tension, uncertain whispers, and the uneasy stillness before a storm. This is the night of the long knives. But for now, we start before the night, when Germany was silent, waiting, not knowing what was about to come. Where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're in a warm room, lights dim, or perhaps lying under a soft blanket with headphones on. What time is it there? Midnight, or somewhere between wake and rest? Before we move deeper into tonight's tale, if you enjoy calm stories like this, stories meant to ease your mind before sleep, you can tap like and subscribe. No rush. You can do it later, maybe after you've already fallen asleep. Germany in the early 1930s was a country caught between the past and an uncertain future. The air carried memories of struggle, of hunger, of defeat, and of promises that hadn't been kept. People longed for something steady, something that could hold their lives together again. But behind that longing, a quiet unease began to take root. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, even when no one speaks. The streets of Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg were alive with activity by day. Markets reopened, people worked, children played in the courtyards. But when night fell, conversations changed, voices lowered, windows closed early. There was a sense that change was coming, but no one could tell whether it would bring comfort or fear. As political speeches echoed through radios and halls, people listened, hoping to hear something that made sense of their pain. Yet the louder the promises grew, the more distant peace seemed to become. Movements rose and fell, and in the middle of it all, one man's ambition began to reshape the nation's course. Not through open war, but through quiet calculation. You can imagine those days like standing on a frozen lake. Still, beautiful, and seemingly solid, but beneath the surface, cracks were spreading. Germany was exhausted from years of instability, but the path to strength would come at a heavy cost. And most people, trying to rebuild their lives, could not see what was coming in the shadows. If you're still awake, take a slow breath. You might notice your body sinking a little deeper into comfort. Let the warmth of the story and the calm tone slow your thoughts. History can be unsettling, yes, but tonight, we're not here to relive the fear. We're here to understand it. Quietly, from a distance. Power, in those years, was shifting like sand in a storm. Old alliances fractured. Some leaders spoke of loyalty, others of revolution. Each man saw himself as the one who could save the nation. And somewhere in that struggle, the line between friend and rival began to blur. In the cafes and meeting halls, whispers turned into rumors. Letters carried half-truths and suspicions. No one knew who could be trusted anymore. And when a society begins to fear its own reflection, something dark begins to take shape in its silence. The unease was not just political, it was personal. Neighbors eyed one another differently. Small disagreements became reasons for distance. Even within the same movement, loyalty was a fragile thing. The air was thick with caution, as if the entire country was holding its breath. Every night, as the lamps flickered out, a strange quiet took over the cities. There were fewer footsteps, fewer laughs, and fewer reasons to stay outside. It was as if the entire nation sensed a storm building, yet no one could tell where it would strike first. Germany was entering a chapter of history where silence spoke louder than words. If you're listening as you drift toward sleep, let your thoughts slow down again. Let the tension of the past remain in the past. You're safe, warm, and distant from those years of unrest. This story is only a soft echo, a reminder that history, no matter how dark, can be listened to gently from the safety of the present. Somewhere in those early summer days of 1934, plans were forming. They were quiet, careful, and meant to stay hidden, but history has a way of revealing even the most secret of intentions. Soon, that silence would break, and when it did, the world would never see Germany the same way again. The tension that had been growing for months was now impossible to ignore. Germany felt quieter than usual, not in peace, but in anticipation. The air carried a sense of waiting, like the moment before thunder. Everyone seemed to feel it, yet no one dared to name it aloud. Something was shifting beneath the surface, and the silence felt heavier each day. In the government halls, decisions were made behind closed doors. Meetings stretched late into the night. Names were mentioned, erased, and replaced again. Trust had become a rare currency, and ambition a dangerous weapon. No one could tell who would rise next, or who would disappear from sight. Even those who held power felt uncertain. They had built their influence through loyalty, but loyalty was fragile. Rumors of plots and betrayals spread like smoke through corridors. And while the public still believed in unity, the truth was far more fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind. By late June, the air felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just politics anymore, it was survival. Some men wrote letters to their families, others stayed awake at night, listening to the sound of engines outside their homes. Everyone sensed that something decisive was near. The question was when. If you're still listening, notice how quiet the world around you feels. The story slows, and your heartbeat matches its rhythm. You can almost hear the faint echo of footsteps on old cobblestones, the hush of night air brushing against stone walls. History becomes softer when heard in this way, like a memory slowly fading. Germany's leader, now surrounded by both loyalists and rivals, had reached a decision. He believed his power was being threatened from within. To him, the only solution was swift and final. Plans were whispered, messages delivered in code, and a date was chosen, June 30th. That night would not begin with chaos or sound. It would begin in stillness. Cars would roll quietly through sleeping towns, doors would open without a knock, and the shape of the nation would shift in silence. No one would know until the morning what had truly happened. In homes across Germany, families slept unaware. The world outside moved carefully, a quiet storm unfolding without thunder. The streets, the countryside, even the skies above seemed to hold their breath. It was a night where history changed quietly, not with shouts, but with silence. As dawn approached, the city lights began to glow faintly. A new day was coming, but the country that would awaken was no longer the same. The unease of the past weeks had found its answer, sharp, cold, and irreversible. The silence had spoken, and now, as you rest and listen, let the story fade gently. The past belongs to the past. Its lessons stay, but its fear does not reach us here. The fire beside you crackles softly. The night is calm again. You can breathe, close your eyes, and let history drift quietly into dreams. Germany was trying to rebuild itself from the ground up. The people were weary, tired of broken promises, inflation, and political games. Each new voice that rose to power seemed to offer hope, but hope was fragile. It came and went like passing wind. leaving behind the same hunger, the same struggle. Still, the people listened, because even false hope is softer than silence. The streets were filled with posters, speeches, and parades. Leaders appeared everywhere in newspapers, on corners, through the static hum of the radio. Each claimed to have the solution, the way forward, the strength the country needed. But behind those words, something colder was taking shape. Power was no longer about vision, it was about survival. In the early 1930s, alliances formed quickly. Some men promised loyalty to gain safety. Others promised safety to gain loyalty. The line between the two was almost invisible. Every handshake carried both trust and suspicion. And behind every smile, there was a question: who would still be standing when the struggle was over? One group in particular had grown restless. They were young, disciplined, and hungry for recognition. They called themselves protectors of the movement, but many in power saw them differently, as unpredictable, too loud, too proud. And though they were once praised, now their strength began to feel like a threat. Germany was filled with uniforms, symbols, and the illusion of order. To the public, it looked like unity, but beneath the surface, rival factions were forming. Each believed it was the true heart of the revolution. And as they tried to shape the same dream, they slowly began to destroy one another. The leader at the top tried to balance it all. He needed their loyalty, their energy, their presence, but not their independence. He could not afford anyone who might grow too powerful. And so, quietly, a plan began to form. To remove the danger, even if that danger once helped build his rise. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the weight of those choices. They weren't made in anger, but in calculation. In dark rooms filled with maps and lists, decisions were written that would soon decide the fate of thousands. The seeds of power had been planted, and they would not bloom gently. The nation's mood began to change. The cheering crowds became quieter. The public speeches more rehearsed, more careful. The tone shifted from hope to control. People noticed, but few dared to speak. They told themselves it was temporary, that soon things would be better. But deep down, they knew change like this rarely brings peace. If you're still awake, the world of 1934 feels far away now, faded, distant, and slow. Yet the feeling of uncertainty, the quiet before something irreversible, remains universal. Every moment of history begins softly. Every great storm starts with a whisper. And in that whisper, Germany's next chapter was already beginning. One that would test loyalty, reshape power, and erase the illusion of safety forever. By the middle of 1934, those whispers of power had grown into quiet plans. The factions that once stood side by side were now separated by suspicion. Each claimed to be the truest voice of the movement, but none could see that their struggle was only feeding the ambitions of one man. It was no longer about ideals or rebuilding the nation. It was about who would control the machinery of fear and who would be crushed beneath it. Meetings became colder, conversations shorter. Even laughter among officials sounded rehearsed. The leader at the center of it all had learned that power needed silence, and fear was the best way to create it. He watched carefully as his allies competed, each unaware that their rivalry would soon become their undoing. The stage was set, and every player had already taken their place. The restless faction, once celebrated for its loyalty and discipline, was now seen as a problem too large to ignore. They wanted recognition, new roles, and more authority, but the government's inner circle began to whisper that they were dangerous, reckless, even disloyal. Whether true or not, those whispers would soon become justification for something far greater. Outside the halls of power, ordinary people went about their lives, unaware of the storm forming above them. Shops opened, trams rattled down the streets, and families gathered for dinner as if nothing was wrong. Yet the newspapers had changed their tone, quieter, more controlled. The headlines praised unity, but beneath them lay warnings between the lines. Those who understood politics sensed the danger. They saw that old promises were fading and that ambition had no friends. History was closing in on itself, wrapping loyalty and betrayal into one. It was no longer a battle of ideas, it was a contest of who would strike first. And soon, the contest would no longer be hidden. If you're listening now, let your mind wander through that quiet moment in history. The calm before the fall, the flicker of a lamp in a meeting room, the shuffle of papers on a polished table, the faint ticking of a clock as midnight approaches. Every detail feels still, yet heavy with what's about to unfold. In one of those rooms, lists were being prepared. Names written in careful ink, sealed in envelopes, and passed only to trusted hands. The leader spoke softly, almost kindly, as he explained that these steps were necessary for safety, for unity, for the future. But power often hides behind gentle words, and by the time morning came, mercy would no longer be part of the plan. Far from those rooms, the restless factions still believed they could negotiate. They thought they were too valuable to lose. Some even planned to meet, to explain, to find understanding. But history rarely waits for explanations. Once fear begins to guide power, reason no longer matters. The plan was already in motion. As the month of June drew near, a strange stillness returned to the cities, the same quiet that had once filled Germany years before. People sensed something changing again, they just didn't know what it was. In truth, the seeds of power had already grown roots deep beneath them, and nothing could stop what was coming next. And as the final week of June approached, history itself seemed to pause. The air grew heavy, the whispers stopped, and the silence deepened. Soon, the calm would break, and in one single night, the struggle for power would end. But not through words, only through the quiet steps of those sent to carry out what had already been decided. The storm did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, quietly, like the steady roll of clouds across a darkening sky. Germany looked peaceful from the outside, orderly streets, tidy parades, flags fluttering in the wind. But beneath that calm surface, tension was growing, unseen but deeply felt. The kind of tension that hums just below hearing, until it becomes impossible to ignore. The movement that once united thousands had begun to fracture. Ambition had turned inward, and loyalty became something that could be traded. Those who had helped build the foundation of power now found themselves pushed aside, treated as obstacles rather than allies. And when ambition meets fear, history has a way of choosing its own storm. Within the highest circles of authority, trust had thinned to almost nothing. Private conversations became rehearsed performances. Every word, every glance was weighed for hidden meaning. Some smiled too much, others spoke too carefully. They all knew that being noticed could mean the end of a career, or worse. Silence became the safest language. Outside, the city lights glowed as if nothing had changed. People went to work, children played in the courtyards, and radios hummed softly with patriotic tunes. But there was a strange edge in the air, something you could not name, but you could feel. It was the quiet before thunder, and those who listened closely knew that something irreversible was approaching. Rumors began to take form, like shadows, stretching across the walls of power. Some said a conspiracy was being prepared. Others whispered that it was only a pretext. In truth, it no longer mattered what was true or false. Once fear begins to lead, truth becomes just another tool. And in that summer of 1934, fear was in full command. If you listen closely now, you can almost imagine the rhythm of those days, the echo of footsteps in marble corridors, the faint click of typewriters producing reports that would decide fates, the murmured conversations behind closed doors. History moves quietly at first, almost kindly, before it decides to show its weight. The storm was not just political, it was deeply personal. Old friends had become strangers. Men who once shared the same table now avoided each other's eyes. Every alliance seemed temporary, every promise uncertain. It was a time when silence was safer than truth, and pretending not to know was the only way to stay untouched. For the leader at the center of it all, this silence was power. He understood that fear could unify what loyalty could not. His speeches grew sharper, his words more absolute. The public saw confidence, but those close to him saw calculation. The man who had risen through chaos was now preparing to use it again, this time from above. By late June, the final preparations were being made. The night of action was no longer an idea. It was a date marked quietly in the minds of a few. Every car, every order, every name had been chosen carefully. The plan would not begin with shouting or warning. It would begin with a knock at the door, soft and precise. And as the sun set over Berlin, no one outside those circles had any idea what was coming. The city lights blinked gently, unaware of the history about to unfold beneath them. The air was still, heavy, and strangely calm, as if the entire country was holding its breath, waiting for the first drop of rain before the storm broke. The final hours before the storm were eerily calm. Streets were quiet, radios played soft music, and most of the country slept under a blanket of stillness. Yet, in government buildings and hidden offices, the atmosphere was heavy. Papers were being signed, telephones rang in short bursts, and men spoke in hushed tones, confirming routes, names, and times. Everything had to appear ordinary, even as the extraordinary approached. In the countryside, convoys of cars waited by the roadside. Headlights were dimmed, engines left idling. Orders had been given not to draw attention. Every driver knew their task, though few understood the full meaning of it. The operation had to be quick, precise, and quiet. Once it began, there would be no turning back. Somewhere in the heart of Berlin, the leader stood by a window, watching the dark horizon. He knew the decision he had made would change everything, not just for his rivals, but for himself. Power demands loyalty, but it also demands fear, and in that moment, he believed that fear would be his greatest ally. Inside hotel rooms and government offices, the accused slept unaware. Some had heard rumors but dismissed them. Others trusted that their friendship and past loyalty would protect them. But history rarely moves with mercy, and when power feels threatened, even friendship becomes disposable. If you're still awake, imagine the sound of distant engines rolling through the night. The rhythm is steady, not rushed. The men inside those cars are calm, their faces unreadable. The moon above offers faint light, glimmering over rooftops and quiet fields. The world is asleep, yet history is wide awake. As midnight passed, arrests began. Doors opened to voices that spoke firmly, almost politely. There was no shouting, no chaos, just swift, organized movement. Some understood what was happening too late. Others didn't resist at all. The The storm had begun without thunder, without warning, just as planned. By dawn, the quiet streets of Germany had changed. The people woke to newspaper headlines filled with reassurances that order had been restored, that enemies of the state had been stopped. The nation was told that it was a necessary act for peace. But peace bought with fear is never real peace. It only sleeps for a while. In the days that followed, silence became law. Conversations grew shorter, glances more cautious. Everyone seemed to know what had happened, but no one dared to say it aloud. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, invisible yet felt in every household, every office, every breath. Power had been secured. The rival faction was gone, erased as if they had never existed. Only one voice remained at the top, calm and unchallenged. But even as control settled, a strange emptiness followed. The price of absolute power was isolation, and the leader, though triumphant, had surrounded himself with fear. If you're still here, let the story fade into stillness again. The storm has passed. The night is quiet once more. The fire beside you burns low, and the air feels gentle. History has done what it always does, remind us how fragile peace can be. So take a slow breath, feel the calm return, and let the noise of that past fade softly into the quiet of your own night. Suspicion is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout or rush. It creeps slowly, wrapping itself around the edges of every conversation. After the storm, Germany appeared calm again. The speeches were confident, the newspapers full of praise. But behind that polished surface, the air had changed. People spoke carefully now. They weighed each word, each glance, each silence. The fear of saying the wrong thing lingered in every room. Those who survived the purge knew better than to ask questions. They smiled when expected, nodded when necessary, and stayed invisible whenever possible. The night of arrests had ended, but its shadow stretched far beyond dawn. It reached into daily life, into friendships, workplaces, even families. Suspicion had become part of survival. In government halls, loyalty was no longer a comfort. It was a performance. To disagree was dangerous, but to agree to eagerly could also invite attention. People learned to remain neutral, to blend into the background. The safest thing was to say nothing at all. Silence, once unsettling, had now become protection. Letters were written in vague language, meetings shortened, and visits cancelled without reason. Even those who had done nothing wrong felt watched. The eyes of authority were everywhere, in the press, in the offices, in the unspoken rules that shaped every interaction. The world had turned cautious, as if the air itself carried consequences. If you're still awake, let yourself picture that silence. A city alive yet muted, conversations whispered near windows, footsteps soft on stone corridors. The sound of history after the storm is not loud, it's steady, patient, and filled with the kind of quiet that can make anyone uneasy. Whispers soon turned into subtle rumors. People speculated about who would be next, who was in favor, who had fallen out of sight. Those who had once seemed untouchable now avoided attention. No one knew what was truth anymore. Every story had two versions, the one told publicly, and the one only dared to be thought privately. The leader's control seemed absolute, yet it was built on fragile ground. Power born from fear needs constant tending. He trusted few, and those he did trust trusted him even less. Around him were advisors who agreed with every decision, not because they believed in it, but because they had no choice. That kind of silence, too, becomes a kind of storm. In public, the nation celebrated strength, and stability. Banners waved, speeches echoed, and the illusion of unity was carefully maintained. But in private, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, the people understood that one misstep could erase them entirely. The shadow of suspicion reached every corner, and no one stood completely beyond it. Those who worked close to power learned to hide their thoughts behind polite smiles. They became experts in small talk, in saying much while meaning nothing. It was a strange, exhausting way to live, like walking through fog, never sure who might be listening just beyond it. And in that endless caution, Germany entered a new kind of quiet, not the peace of safety, but the stillness of fear. The nation had survived the storm, but now it lived beneath its shadow. And sometimes, the silence after power speaks louder than the noise that built it. As the months passed, the feeling of unease settled deeper into daily life. The purge had ended, but its ghost lingered. People began to measure their words, even in their own homes. Trust, once natural, became something rare. Even a friend's question could sound like a trap. The quiet between two people was no longer comfortable. It was full of guessing and restraint. The newspapers printed stories of progress and success, of order restored and peace achieved. Yet behind those words, there was a silence that everyone understood but no one dared to name. It was the silence of fear, the kind that hums beneath daily life, invisible but everywhere. Each citizen had learned the same lesson. What you don't say can keep you safe. In the offices of power, suspicion had become the air itself. Advisors competed not through ideas, but through proximity. Whoever stood closest to authority appeared loyal until someone else whispered otherwise. Reports circulated about hidden disloyalties, often invented, but always believed. Facts mattered less than who could tell the story first. At dinners and gatherings, the mood was oddly calm. Smiles were practiced. Laughter never reached the eyes. Every compliment carried calculation, every gesture a hidden weight. Those who once spoke boldly now watched their own sentences as if they were walking through glass. It wasn't just politics anymore, it was survival through stillness. If you're still listening, let your mind drift into that atmosphere for a moment. The echo of boots in marble corridors, the soft tick of a clock in a quiet office, the low murmur of a conversation that never says what it truly means. That's the sound of a nation learning to speak in half-truths, where every sentence feels like a risk. The leader, though victorious, grew restless. Power brings control, but it also brings isolation. Surrounded by men who only echoed his words, he began to see threats everywhere, in looks, in letters, even in silence. He had built a fortress of loyalty, but inside that fortress, he was alone. Suspicion no longer protected him. It consumed him. Germany, on the surface, seemed organized and strong. The trains ran on time, the flags waved in perfect rows, the crowds cheered on command. But within that image of perfection, something vital had gone missing: trust. Without it, the nation moved like a machine, efficient, obedient, and soulless. Families whispered warnings to their children. Do not ask questions. Do not repeat what you hear. The schools taught discipline. The newspapers taught pride. But both avoided truth. In such a world, truth became dangerous. Even memory itself had to be reshaped, rewritten, to match what was safe to believe. As time went on, the fear became ordinary. People no longer flinched when someone disappeared. They simply adjusted, like eyes learning to see in the dark. That's how suspicion works. It doesn't end with a single event. It becomes the rhythm of life, the quiet drum that everyone learns to follow. And as you rest now, the firelight of this story begins to dim. The storm has passed, but its echo lingers in the still air of history. The shadows of suspicion remind us that power gained through fear never truly sleeps. It waits, quietly, beneath the surface, patient, invisible, and always listening. The summer air grew heavy again, thick with tension that no one dared to name. After months of uneasy quiet, the sense of safety that people pretended to feel began to fade. Something was changing, though no one could quite describe it. The fear that had once hidden in corners was now moving out into the open. Germany, still glowing under its image of unity, was beginning to tremble beneath the surface. In the offices of power, there was talk of threats, of unseen enemies plotting from within. Files appeared overnight, full of accusations that few believed but everyone obeyed. Each rumor felt rehearsed, crafted carefully to create just enough fear to justify another act of control. The machine of power was turning again, and this time its movements were slower, colder, and more deliberate. Across the cities, people began to feel the return of unease. Late-night knocks on doors no longer startled anyone. They simply confirmed what everyone already knew: that safety was temporary, that peace was borrowed. Some nights, the streets fell into such silence that even the faint hum of a radio felt intrusive. It was as if the whole country had decided to breathe more quietly. In the countryside, farmers worked under the same sun, pretending that nothing had changed. But even there, whispers traveled fast, of new arrests, of names removed from offices and schools, of neighbors suddenly gone. Fear traveled faster than fact, and in time, people stopped asking why. They simply accepted that things disappeared, as if history itself was erasing what it no longer wanted to remember. If you're still awake, imagine standing in that uneasy calm, the quiet before something breaks. You can almost feel the weight in the air, that strange heaviness that settles before a storm. Every sound feels sharper: footsteps on gravel, the rustle of leaves, the low hum of wind through distant windows. It's the kind of silence that doesn't soothe, it warns. The leaders who held power appeared calm in public, but inside, their meetings grew tense. Decisions were made with fewer words, and every sentence carried double meaning. Plans were no longer shared freely, only fragments were spoken, enough to keep others guessing. No one trusted the full truth anymore, because no one could be certain who was still safe to tell it to. The nation's newspapers continued their rhythm of praise, speaking of order, progress, and peace. But those who read between the lines could sense the shift. The tone was more cautious now, the words sharper. The smiles in photographs felt stiff, rehearsed. Even the most ordinary announcements carried an undertone of quiet threat. Inside homes, families began to speak less. Dinner conversations grew shorter. Radio dials were turned low. Some kept journals hidden under floorboards. Others burned them out of fear. It wasn't that people stopped caring. It was that caring too openly had become dangerous. And in a world ruled by suspicion, silence was the only safety left. As the days moved closer to the end of June, the air seemed to thicken. Every whisper felt amplified, every rumor believable. Those in power were restless, and those below them were afraid. The storm that had once passed now gathered again, darker, heavier, and closer than before. And through it all, the streets remained quiet. The flags still waved, the music still played, the parades still marched. But beneath the noise of celebration, the dread was growing. It was the kind of fear that does not shout. It hums, softly, endlessly, until it becomes part of the silence itself. By the final week of June, it was clear that something was about to happen. The tension was no longer hidden. It lived in the way people walked, the way they spoke, even the way they looked at one another. Conversations began and ended in half sentences. Everyone knew too much, and no one dared to say it aloud. It was as if the entire nation was standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the first stone to fall. In the higher circles of command, meetings grew shorter and colder. Reports arrived sealed, delivered by hand. Names were spoken carefully, followed by silence. The list of people to watch grew longer each day, yet no one dared to ask who was writing it or why. The machinery of fear had begun to move again, smooth and precise, without sound. The leader's public image remained calm and steady. He smiled in front of crowds, shook hands, and spoke of unity. But behind closed doors, he was restless. Those closest to him whispered that he no longer slept well, that he spent long nights pacing, reading reports by dim light. He feared betrayal from those who had once stood beside him, and his paranoia gave birth to a plan. Orders were drafted quietly. Messages written in code were sent to trusted hands. Certain men were told to travel, others to stay home. No one received the full picture. Each was given only a small piece. It was how secrecy worked best, through fragments that formed meaning only when it was too late to stop. If you listen closely, you might imagine that night air again, heavy, motionless, full of waiting. The faint sound of engines somewhere distant. The quiet creak of a door opening in the dark. It's a stillness that doesn't calm the heart, but tightens it, reminding you that peace can break at any moment. In the days leading up to June 30th, rumors began to slip through the cracks. Some claimed there would be arrests. Others swore it was only a political test. But the tone in every whisper was the same: fear, disguised as curiosity. No one wanted to believe another storm was coming, yet everyone felt it in their bones. Across the country, soldiers were told to be ready. Trains were rerouted, phone lines monitored, and certain regions went eerily quiet. The preparations were so vast, so coordinated, that it was hard to understand how most people still went about their days, pretending life was normal. Perhaps pretending was the only thing left to do. In the final hours before nightfall, the world seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, the first convoy of cars waited in the dark, engines low, headlights dimmed. Men inside checked their orders one last time, the paper trembling slightly in their hands. History was about to shift again, not with a roar, but with a whisper. Back in the cities, no one knew the time had come. Windows were closed, radios played softly, and families drifted to sleep, unaware of what the night would bring. The streets were calm, the air still, the stars distant and cold. Yet beneath that calm, the machinery of power was already awake and moving. And as the clock neared midnight, the final calm before the storm arrived, deep, heavy, and complete. It was a silence, too perfect, too deliberate. The kind of silence that only exists before history decides to speak again. It began quietly. The night of June 30th, 1934, did not open with thunder or alarm. The world slipped into darkness, as it always did, softly, naturally, without a hint of what was about to unfold. The cities of Germany slept beneath a heavy sky, unaware that before dawn, history would change in silence. Engines started far from the city lights. Black cars rolled through the countryside, their tires humming over empty roads. The men inside spoke little. They carried papers, sealed instructions, and the weight of orders that none of them dared to question. Each knew what was expected, but none knew how the night would end. That uncertainty hung in the air like mist, clinging to every breath. In the city, the leader sat in near darkness, surrounded by maps and reports. The lamp on his desk burned low, casting long shadows across the room. He had already made his decision. The plan was set in motion, one that would reshape the movement, remove his rivals, and secure his rule. Outside his window, the city looked calm, peaceful even, but he knew that peace was only an illusion. The first arrests began just after midnight. Doors opened to quiet knocks, boots on wooden floors, voices calm but firm. There was no shouting, no chaos. Everything happened as if rehearsed, fast, efficient, and mercilessly precise. The night air swallowed every sound. From the outside, it might have seemed like the world had simply gone to sleep. Some of those taken were confused, others resigned. They had heard rumors but never believed they were in danger. Their loyalty had been public, their support unquestioned. But loyalty was no protection now. Once suspicion had a name, no defense mattered. They were led away under the pretense of safety, though none would return. If you're still awake, imagine the quiet of that moment, the echo of footsteps in narrow hallways, the click of a door closing behind someone, the hum of engines vanishing into the distance. There was no sound of anger, no warning cry, only calm, mechanical motion. History, once again, moved in whispers. In hotels, military bases, and private homes, the same scene repeated again and again. The men who had once shared meals, laughter, and plans were now separated by fear. Some begged for explanations, others remained silent. But there were no answers. The orders came from the highest voice, and that voice allowed no questions. By 2 in the morning, entire districts had been swept. The cars returned quietly, headlights off, their passengers slumped in uneasy silence. Those who carried out the orders avoided each other's eyes. They followed commands, but deep down, they knew something irreversible had happened. Across the city, the sky was still and pale, the faintest glow of dawn beginning to rise. The leader remained awake, waiting for confirmation that everything had gone according to plan. He told himself that this was necessary, that strength demanded sacrifice. Yet, even as the reports arrived, there was no satisfaction in his face, only a deep, wordless fatigue. And as the first light of morning touched the rooftops, Germany stirred from its sleep. The birds began to sing, the streets began to move, and the world looked unchanged. But it wasn't. In a single night, lines had been erased, loyalties rewritten, and fear had claimed its permanent place at the heart of power. The night deepened, and with it came a strange rhythm, the hum of engines, the knock on doors, the low exchange of voices that never rose above a whisper. Across Germany, the same quiet pattern unfolded in different towns, at different hours, as if the entire country was breathing in sync with the machinery of control. What began as a plan on paper was now alive, moving, unstoppable. Somewhere in the distance, faint lights flickered through the trees as convoys approached their next destinations. The men inside those vehicles said little. Each name on their lists was another step toward what they called security, though few truly believed it. Fear had become the fuel that powered obedience, and silence its companion. The night had its own logic, cold, precise, and absolute. Those who were taken never saw it coming. Some were woken gently, told they were needed for questioning. Others were called outside without explanation. In that moment between confusion and realization, most stayed calm, perhaps believing that loyalty would protect them. But in this night, loyalty no longer meant safety. It meant nothing at all. Inside the capital, telephones rang softly, connecting one office to another. Messages passed through coded phrases, confirming that each target had been found. There was no urgency in the voices, only routine, as if this were just another task to complete before morning. It was that calmness, more than anything, that made the night so terrifying. If you listen closely, you can almost imagine the sound, the muted rumble of cars fading into the distance, the rustle of papers shuffled on a desk, the still air between two breaths. History rarely announces itself. It hides in these quiet spaces, where decisions are carried out without noise, where lives are rewritten in the dark. By the time dawn approached, the operation was nearly complete. Reports returned to headquarters, confirming each arrest, each disappearance. The leader, still awake, received them one by one. The plan had succeeded. The names that once filled his thoughts with worry had been removed. The silence he longed for had finally arrived. But silence is rarely peaceful when it is built from fear. In that calm, something uneasy stirred. The men who followed orders that night did not celebrate. Some avoided each other's eyes, others washed their hands again and again, as if to erase what they had done, yet none dared to question. They had seen what happened to those who did. As the sun rose over Germany, the first headlines began to spread. They told the people what to believe, that the danger had been stopped, that traitors had been found, that the nation was safe again. The words were firm and simple, but between each line lay an unspoken truth. Safety and silence had become the same thing. Families who read the morning paper felt an odd mixture of relief and fear. Relief that the turmoil was over, fear that it might return without warning. They did not speak of it aloud, not even at the breakfast table. The walls, they said, had ears. And after that night, no one doubted it anymore. And so, as the morning light spilled gently across the country, a new day began, bright, quiet, and heavy with what had been done in the dark. The night of the long knives had ended, but its echo remained. It lingered in the silence of the streets, in the caution of every word, in the realization that power, once it tastes fear, never truly sleeps again. The night was nearly over, yet it felt endless. The air was still, heavy, and cold. Across Germany, the last echoes of movement faded into silence. The engines had stopped, the boots no longer struck the pavement, and behind closed doors, reports were quietly sealed and signed. What remained was a stillness so deep, it seemed as if the country itself was holding its breath. Those who had carried out their orders returned home before sunrise. Their uniforms were neat, their expressions unreadable. Some went straight to bed without speaking. Others sat awake in the dark, staring at their hands, their minds heavy with the soundless weight of what they had done. For them, the silence after was worse than the night itself. In the capital, the leader sat alone in his office, the first light of dawn creeping through the curtains. His work was done. The rivals who had once surrounded him were gone. The voices that challenged him had been silenced. Yet there was no victory in his face, only fatigue. Power had been secured, but it came with the kind of quiet that felt like a shadow rather than peace. The newspapers had already begun their work. Writers drafted official explanations, choosing their words carefully, crafting sentences that sounded reassuring. The operation, they would say, was necessary to protect the nation, to maintain stability, to defend unity. Those words would be repeated across radio broadcasts before most people even finished their breakfast. If you're still awake, imagine that pale light of morning after such a night. The mist resting low over the streets, the faint sound of a train in the distance, and the emptiness that follows when fear has done its work. It is not the sound of safety, it is the sound of something missing. A silence that feels alive, watching, waiting. By sunrise, the city began to stir. Shopkeepers opened their doors, children hurried to schools, and the world moved as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But beneath that normal rhythm, the air was thick with uncertainty. Everyone had heard something, though no one knew what was true. The fewer questions asked, the safer the day would be. Inside offices and homes, conversations began in cautious tones. "Did you hear?" someone might whisper. "I heard it was a plot," another would reply. The details were never the same, but the message was those who vanished must have deserved it. It was easier to believe that than to face the truth, that anyone could disappear without reason. The morning sun reached higher, spilling gold across the rooftops. But its light felt strange, too bright against the uneasy quiet below. Germany was awake, yet the country felt different, restrained, tense, aware. It was not peace that followed the night. It was control. In the following hours, official statements were read aloud to the nation. Calm voices assured the people that justice had been served. The newspapers printed the same headlines from one end of the country to the other, and though the public nodded, listened, and moved on, everyone could feel that something unseen had shifted. And as the morning deepened, the silence continued, not the peace of relief, but the kind of silence that hums in the background of every word, every decision, every thought. It was the silence that comes not after noise, but after certainty itself has been taken away. By mid-morning, the city seemed awake again. Carts rolled through the streets, newspapers changed hands, and voices returned, low, cautious, controlled. Yet under every polite greeting, there was a tremor. People smiled more than usual, laughed more softly, as if to prove nothing had changed. But deep inside, they knew something was different now. The air itself seemed to listen. The headlines were everywhere. Each one carried the same message, that the danger had passed, that the nation was secure again, that decisive action had saved the future. No one dared to question it. Those who read the papers did so with quiet eyes, scanning the names printed between the lines. Some found names they knew, some didn't, and those who did never mentioned them aloud. Behind closed doors, whispers replaced conversation. Families spoke in careful fragments. The words "it's better not to ask" became a quiet rule that everyone understood. Even the walls seemed unsafe. And so the silence that began in fear now grew into habit, the way people lived, the way they survived. In government offices, the tone was different. The atmosphere was one of control, but not confidence. The leader's authority was unquestioned, yet his inner circle had grown smaller, tighter, more afraid. Power had been secured, but at a price that could never be undone. They had built stability from silence, and silence has a way of echoing back. If you're still here, still listening, you might notice the rhythm of it. The way fear doesn't vanish when the noise stops. It lingers like smoke after fire, clinging to everything, impossible to wash away. The dawn was beautiful that morning, but beneath its light was something cold and unspoken. Out in the countryside, the farms and villages heard the news later in the day. The radios spoke of traitors, of decisive justice, of calm restored. And though people nodded along, they felt a chill they couldn't explain. There were no explosions, no battles, no marches, only the quiet removal of those who were once part of the same promise. The people learned quickly what the new silence meant. It was not just the absence of noise. It was the presence of watching, eyes everywhere, ears everywhere. They adjusted, slowly, shaping their lives around what could not be said. It became normal to think carefully, to trust little, to listen more than to speak. By evening, the city glowed again under the same warm lights, as if the night before had never happened. Couples walked, shop signs flickered, the sounds of music drifted faintly from cafes. Yet beneath the comfort of normal life, the unspoken truth lingered. Everything had changed, and pretending otherwise was the only way forward. For the leader, the silence was proof of success. No rebellion, no protests, no defiance, only obedience. But even he could not escape the stillness he had created. It followed him everywhere, into every room, into every sleepless night. The quiet he had demanded now surrounded him completely, and as darkness returned once more, Germany slipped into a new kind of night, not one of chaos or noise, but one of perfect order. The silence that followed the storm had become the law itself, and though the dawn had come, it no longer promised light. It promised control and the uneasy peace of a nation that had learned to whisper. The morning after carried a strange calm. The streets looked ordinary, washed in pale sunlight, as if the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. Shops opened on time, children hurried to school, and the sound of footsteps returned to the cobblestones. But beneath that normal rhythm, the air felt wrong, too clean, too quiet, as though something vital had been removed. People read the morning papers with steady hands, pretending not to notice how different the headlines felt. The articles spoke of order restored, of leadership and courage, of a nation cleansed of danger. The language was simple, confident, and final. There were no questions, no explanations, just declarations. It was a story told with such certainty that doubting it felt unsafe. In homes across Germany, families sat at breakfast tables with the radio murmuring in the background. The announcer's voice was calm, even comforting, as he repeated the official account. Words like loyalty, stability, and security filled the air. Yet for many listening, those same words now carried a quiet dread. They had heard them before, and each time, the silence that followed grew heavier. In the government buildings, the atmosphere was sharp but subdued. The men who remained in power moved carefully, speaking only when necessary. They congratulated one another in whispers, aware that every victory left fewer allies to trust. Fear had become a habit, invisible but constant, the unspoken currency of survival. If you're still awake, picture that morning light creeping over the city rooftops. The same streets, the same voices, the same routines. Nothing outwardly wrong, yet something missing that no one could name. The kind of emptiness that comes not from what's lost, but from what's been silenced. Outside the capital, word of the events spread slowly. Villagers heard rumors through travelers and radio signals. Some refused to believe them, others nodded quietly, saying only that it was better this way, that peace sometimes required hard choices. It was easier to believe necessity than to face cruelty. In the cafes, people spoke softly over coffee cups. A few repeated the official story with careful precision, as though rehearsing it. Others stayed quiet, eyes on the table, stirring sugar into silence. Everyone knew that the wrong question, even an innocent one, could travel farther than intended. The morning after the purge felt almost peaceful, not the peace of safety, but of exhaustion. After so much fear, stillness became a strange kind of relief. People wanted to believe the worst was over, that this was the end of the storm. Yet deep inside, they sensed that it was only the beginning of something quieter and far more enduring. As hours passed, the sky turned brighter, the noise of life returned. But those who paid attention could see how much the country had changed. The eyes of strangers met differently now, cautious, searching, half afraid. Germany was awake, but not the same. The silence had become part of its heartbeat, and in that silence, the morning stretched on, calm and endless. It was a day that looked like any other, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened before dawn, and the unspoken understanding that from this point forward, nothing would ever truly be ordinary again. By midday, the illusion of calm had taken hold completely. The markets were open, the factories hummed, and the trains ran on schedule. To an outsider, Germany looked efficient, confident, even proud. But those who lived within its borders could feel the difference, a subtle unease woven into the rhythm of daily life. Conversations were shorter, glances lingered too long, and laughter sounded rehearsed. It was the kind of peace that feels borrowed. The newspapers continued their praise. Columns spoke of decisive leadership, of bold action to preserve unity. The names of the fallen were rarely mentioned, replaced instead with phrases like necessary measures and defense of order. The truth had been edited, cleaned, and reshaped into something easier to accept. History was being rewritten even as the ink dried. In the offices of authority, new faces filled old chairs. Some were ambitious, others cautious. Each man understood that his position was not a reward, but a reminder that he was there because someone else was not. And though the corridors echoed with polite greetings, the air between those greetings was cold. Loyalty was no longer a virtue. It was a performance. If you're still listening, take a slow breath and imagine that quiet hum of a nation trying to move on. The sound of typewriters, the click of shoes on marble floors, the distant ring of a telephone, life continuing as though nothing terrible had occurred. Yet beneath every ordinary sound, there was something brittle, something that could break with a single wrong word. In the countryside, people went about their work, but the rumors had already spread. Stories shifted from village to village. Who was gone? Who had vanished? Who had been seen, taken away in the night? The details changed with every telling, but the message stayed the same. Be careful, stay silent, and don't attract notice. That night, radios once again played music. Soft orchestras filled the air, followed by calm announcements reminding citizens that order had been restored. It was meant to comfort, to assure, and for a moment it almost worked. People wanted to believe that stability had returned, even if they no longer understood what that word meant. In the quiet of homes, some tried to forget. They focused on small things, meals, work, the next day. Others found sleep difficult. Every sound outside the window felt suspicious. Every knock carried memory. Fear had not disappeared with dawn. It had only changed shape, settling quietly into routine. For the leader, the morning brought triumph. He had done what others feared to do. His control was complete. Yet as he stood before his reflection, the victory felt hollow. He had silenced opposition, but in doing so, he had silenced everything else. The voices that once challenged, questioned, or even inspired him. Now there was only quiet, and in that quiet, he was utterly alone. Germany, too, stood in that silence, vast, orderly, subdued. The crowds would still cheer, the flags would still wave, but the meaning behind them had changed. The people no longer followed out of hope, they followed out of caution. The difference was invisible, but everyone could feel it. And as the sun set on that first full day after the purge, the country seemed to exhale, long and slow. The danger had passed, yet the fear remained. The silence of that morning would never truly lift. It would stretch on for years, shaping every word, every thought, every shadow that dared to move beneath the light. The weeks that followed were calm on the surface, but beneath that stillness, something invisible moved. Germany had entered a new rhythm, orderly, obedient, and unnaturally quiet. The storm had passed, yet its echo remained. People carried on with their lives, but every action, every sentence, was measured. The silence had become part of daily routine, a background hum that never faded. In the offices of government, the new hierarchy settled quickly. Desks once occupied by familiar faces now sat empty or were filled by those eager to prove their loyalty. The corridors were polished, the reports punctual, the smiles practiced. It looked efficient, but it felt hollow. Power had been secured, but it no longer inspired respect, only compliance. The newspapers continued to praise progress. Every headline spoke of strength. Every photograph framed perfection. Yet anyone who had lived through the night of arrests could sense the change. The eyes behind the smiles seemed harder now, the tone of the speeches sharper. It wasn't passion that held the nation together anymore. It was fear disguised as discipline. If you're still awake, imagine that stillness, the kind that feels heavy rather than peaceful. A country appearing at ease, but listening too carefully, breathing too evenly. It's the sound of a place that has learned not to move too suddenly. The kind of quiet that follows not rest, but warning. In public, people praised the leadership, speaking of safety and pride. But in private, the same words carried different meanings. Safety meant obedience. Unity meant silence. Even the language had changed. Words that once described ideals were now tools of control, reshaped to serve the powerful. It happened so gradually that most didn't notice, or pretended not to. The men at the top began to speak less openly. Every discussion was guarded. Every decision filtered through fear of misinterpretation. Those who once offered advice now waited to be told what to think. The leader had achieved absolute authority, but absolute power brings a strange isolation. No one dared to disagree, and so he was left surrounded by echoes of his own voice. Outside the halls of politics, ordinary people tried to make sense of their new reality. Life continued, factories worked, schools taught, parades marched, but something vital had disappeared. Hope had been replaced by habit. People no longer believed in the future. They simply followed it, step by step, day by day. The purged names began to fade from memory. Some were erased from records entirely, others rewritten into cautionary tales. The past itself was being reshaped, polished until it fit the version of truth that power demanded. It wasn't only people who had been removed, it was history, piece by piece, rewritten until even the silence felt official. And yet, in that silence, unease began to stir again. Power, once taken, demands constant proof of itself. Those who ruled began to see threats where none existed, betrayal in loyalty, weakness in hesitation. The echo of the storm grew louder within the walls of power itself, a whisper that reminded them what fear can do and how easily it can turn inward. By late summer, Germany appeared stronger than ever. The public saw a nation united, disciplined, and unshakable. But beneath the surface, the echo of power was already beginning to fracture its own foundation, a reminder that silence, once used to control, eventually begins to listen back. As months passed, the quiet that had once felt like relief began to feel heavy. Power had been consolidated, the rivals gone, and the nation stood under one voice. Yet in that very control, cracks began to show. The machine that had been built to enforce silence now began to feed on it, demanding more obedience, more fear, more certainty, even when there was none left to give. The leader's circle had grown smaller. Advisors avoided his eyes, afraid that hesitation might be seen as disloyalty. Every decision required absolute agreement, every gesture studied for meaning. The great halls where plans were once debated now echoed with a single sound, the rhythm of one man's will. And outside those walls, millions followed, not out of faith, but out of quiet necessity. The country looked strong from a distance, banners flying, speeches rising, factories humming. But strength born from silence has a strange emptiness to it. It lacks warmth. It lacks truth. It can only last as long as people pretend not to see what's missing. That pretense, once comfortable, had now begun to ache. Even loyalty, repeated too often, began to sound hollow. If you're still awake, let that image settle for a moment. A world that moves perfectly, precisely, but without feeling. The kind of order that looks calm but hums with quiet exhaustion underneath. It's not chaos that frightens people in such times. It's the realization that they've grown used to this kind of stillness, that it has become normal. By autumn, whispers began to return, softer than before but persistent. Questions hidden in coded language, glances that lasted too long, rumors about the leader's growing isolation. Even within his own government, people began to sense that power had turned inward, consuming itself, doubting itself, afraid of its own echo. It was the same fear that had built the regime, now reflected back upon those who created it. Meanwhile, the people below continued their quiet routines. They worked, they marched, they nodded at the right moments. But inside, something had changed. When fear lasts too long, it begins to fade into numbness. The echo of power had lost its terror. It had become background noise. The silence that once ruled now felt almost empty, a hollow shell of what it once was. In homes, old habits of caution persisted. Radios played softly, conversations drifted toward the ordinary, yet under every small talk there was that same careful restraint. People had learned how to survive, not by believing, but by appearing to. It was the kind of balance that only history could sustain for a while before breaking. The leader, surrounded by portraits and flags, had everything he once wanted. But absolute control left him nowhere to go. The silence he had created to protect his power had turned into a mirror, showing him what he had become. Those who feared him no longer admired him, and those who obeyed him no longer cared. That was the true echo of power, not rebellion, but indifference. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it, the faint hum of a world trapped in its own reflection. A regime that silenced its people only to be swallowed by its own quiet. History would not end here, but it would wait, patiently, for the sound of truth to return. And in that pause, in that hollow calm before the next great shift, the silence held steady. Not peaceful, not threatening, just still. The kind of stillness that comes when a voice has shouted too long and finally runs out of breath. A warning, carried softly through time, that even the loudest power eventually fades into its own echo. Decades later, history would remember those nights not through noise, but through silence. The night of the long knives would be described in documents, in books, in classrooms, but few could ever truly capture the stillness that followed it. It wasn't just a political turning point. It was the moment a nation learned that fear could be dressed as order, and silence could be mistaken for peace. The years moved on, and life returned to its rhythm. Streets were rebuilt, parades grew larger, and the image of strength became part of the country's identity. To many, the past seemed buried. But history has a way of lingering, not in monuments or speeches, but in the quiet spaces between facts. The stillness of that night never truly ended. It became part of the air that generations would breathe without realizing it. In the archives, researchers would later uncover letters and reports, each written with careful precision. The language was formal, polite, almost sterile. Yet between the lines, they could feel the weight of fear. Decisions justified as necessary. Actions described as protective. It was the vocabulary of control, calm, rational, and deeply cold. The kind of tone that hides chaos behind neat handwriting. If you're still awake, picture those faded papers lying in a quiet room, the scent of dust and age, the faint hum of fluorescent light. Someone reads them slowly, tracing each sentence, realizing that the people who wrote them probably never thought they'd be remembered. They believed they were just following instructions. They didn't know their silence would echo through time. Historians often speak of events as if they happen cleanly, a beginning, a middle, an end. But history doesn't work that way. It lingers. It seeps into what comes after, shaping thoughts, shaping fears. The night of the long knives was over by morning, yet its presence continued in the way people spoke, the way they trusted, the way they chose to forget. The stillness of that period wasn't peace. It was a pause, the kind that comes after something irreversible, when no one dares to move for fear of breaking what remains. A fragile calm stretched over a nation that had already seen too much. And under that calm, the consequences waited, patient and unseen. The leader, now unchallenged, believed he had brought order to chaos. But in truth, he had only quieted it. Power built on silence is never steady. It must be maintained endlessly through fear and control until it collapses under its own weight. The stillness that followed the purge was not a foundation, it was a warning. Outside the walls of authority, people continued their lives, working, walking, raising children, yet something in them had changed. They had learned that speaking too freely could be dangerous, that truth was not always safe to tell. Even after the danger had passed, those habits of silence remained. They were passed down like unspoken wisdom, and in time, that stillness became history's most lasting trace. Not the speeches or the parades, not even the fear itself, but the quiet afterward, the part no one could record. The moment when the world moved forward, pretending nothing had happened, while somewhere in the background, the echo of that night continued to whisper softly through the years. So as you rest now, let the story fade like the final note of a song. The fire beside you grows dim, the air cools, and the silence of history settles around you. It asks for nothing, only to be remembered, not with fear, but with the gentle understanding that peace built on silence is never truly still. Years later, the silence of that night would still haunt the pages of history. It lingered not in the noise of what happened, but in what followed, the quiet obedience, the missing names, the unspoken fear that spread like mist through generations. People moved on, but that stillness never left completely. It became part of how a nation remembered itself, carefully, selectively, quietly. When historians looked back, they often found themselves drawn not to the power or the speeches, but to the spaces between them. Those gaps, the places where no one dared to write, spoke louder than any record. It was there, in the absence of words, that the true cost of silence could be felt. Not measured in numbers or dates, but in the slow fading of trust, of voice, of humanity itself. In libraries and museums, the story of that night now rests under glass. Visitors walk past the documents, the faded photographs, the names typed in uneven lines. They pause, read, and move on. Yet every so often, someone lingers longer than the rest. Perhaps they feel what others do not, that history isn't gone. It only waits, quietly, for someone to listen. If you're still here, still awake, you've walked through that silence with me. You've listened to how power can twist itself into calmness, how order can disguise fear, and how history's quietest moments often speak the loudest. These stories are heavy, yes, but in their quiet, they also remind us of the value of truth, of courage, and of voice. As the firelight fades, imagine the past settling back into its place. The pages close, the echoes drift away, and the world outside grows still once more. The story ends where it began, in silence, but it is a silence that asks us to remember, not to fear. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey through history, I invite you to subscribe and return next time. There's always another forgotten story waiting for you. Next, we'll drift into another chapter of the past, a time when the world itself seemed to stop breathing, when bells fell silent, towns emptied, and even the clocks stopped ticking. Our next story asks, what happened when the Black Plague stopped the clocks? Until then, rest well, let the past fade softly, and may peace guide your sleep tonight.